Every day, most people move from place to place for work, shopping, education, events, and more, you name it. There's a variety of reasons people may want to move around a city, and as a consequence, cities must provide a multimodal transit network that ideally provides for everyone. There are many different ways to get around cities, some modes more common than others, but how many are there exactly? Are there any unusual ones? We're going to find those questions out in this video, as well as uncovering the positives and negatives of each transport mode. Before I continue, if you enjoy urbanism and transport content based around New Zealand cities, subscribing is a great way to be notified for future videos. Before we start, I want to quickly give a definition of what a transport mode is. A transport mode is a way of transporting goods or people around from one place to another, but I'm also going to be using 3 additional criteria to help determine what a transport mode is. My first criteria for determining what a transport mode is that it must be able to transport you at least 1 kilometre. Well, technically transport modes can transport you any kilometres. In my opinion, I think you need to have at least a reasonable distance, and 1 kilometre seems reasonable in my opinion. My second criteria for determining what a transport mode is that it must be practical. Quite simply, the transport mode must be safe, and you must be able to store it somewhere when it's not being used. This will rule out some modes that I'll get to at the end. My third and final criteria for determining what a transport mode is that it must be used by someone in the world. Quite simply, there must be evidence of at least one person using this transport mode. Now that we've gone over the definition of a transport mode and the criteria I'm using, let's start finding out how many transport modes there are, starting with generic modes, common modes, obscure modes, and modes that didn't quite fit the criteria. We're starting this list off with the most basic forms of transport. These modes are easy to use and are found in most cities. And what a better way to start than the most simple and basic mode of transport? Walking. Assuming you're able to, you walk every single day, between parts of your house to a simple stroll outside. But what about walking as a transport mode? What are the positives and negatives of moving between one location to another by foot? And for each basic mode, I'll list 3 positives and 3 negatives. The first positive of walking is that it's the cheapest mode of transport. Quite simply, all you need to do to start walking is to get on your feet. As I mentioned earlier, people who are able to walk do so every day, with walking technically being part of each transport commute, albeit for only a small section if other modes are taken. A second positive of walking is that it's very space efficient. As you can see from this video, the wide footpath allows more people to walk on it. While it can be uncomfortable or overwhelming, walking is at least moving a large amount of people around in a large open space. A third positive of walking is that it provides you with exercise while at the same time making you feel happier. As you are constantly moving your limbs, blood flow improves as a result, which can relieve stress, reduce weight, and improve sleep, along with other benefits. Now for the negatives of walking. The first of which is that walking is not a fast transport mode. While walking is very space efficient, the same cannot be said for its speed, as walking 1 kilometre takes 10 to 12 minutes for an adult, much slower than other transport modes I'll cover later. Following on from that, walking over a long distance can be less safe depending on the environment. While walking can induce happiness in you, long distance walking in cities often involve fast moving roads and narrow footpaths, which in addition to time, makes walking less attractive, especially to kids and the elderly. The third negative of walking is that it isn't feasible to carry large items. While there is the option to carry items in a bag, this only works for small items. For larger items like a fridge for example, it's very impractical to carry them around, with a vehicle being much more suitable to transport these types of items. If you want to get some exercise on your way to work, but walking takes too long, you may want to hop on a bike. Like walking, cycling can be done for recreational or transport purposes, with it being a popular transport mode in cities around the world, including Amsterdam. But what are the positives and negatives of cycling? The first positive of cycling is that it's an environmentally friendly mode of transport. Like walking, cycling is a human-powered form of transport, which makes cycling very sustainable, with cycling only producing 21 grams of carbon emissions per kilometre, making cycling have one of the lowest carbon footprints of any transport mode. Another positive of cycling is that it results in improved health. As I mentioned, cycling is a human-powered mode of transport, and so by cycling around, you're improving your fitness. The UN recommends adults get at least 30 minutes of exercise every day, and so by cycling for daily activities, it gives you the exercise you need and allow you to use your time for other purposes. The third positive of cycling is that it's a cheap and simple mode to get around. Similar to walking, all you need to start cycling is just get on a bike and start riding. No license or registration required. E-bikes also cost an average of $1,000 to $4,000 US, with annual maintenance costs of $754 annually, much less than those of cars, which I'll be talking about later. One negative of cycling is that it can be very unsafe if there's little to no bike infrastructure. While cycling is an effective way of getting around, it's most effective if infrastructure like cycleways and protected bike lanes are provided. If the environment is a road with high speeds and you have to swerve between cars, then only riders who are confident or experienced will cycle in them. Another negative of cycling is that they aren't the best way to transport large items. Similar to walking, it is much more difficult to carry large items on bikes, simply due to the mass of the item. However, there are options to carry smaller items around, by storing them in backpacks or baskets. This doesn't mean large items are impossible to transport using bikes, however, it is much more difficult in doing so. One final negative of cycling is that there's not much protection from rain or snow. Obviously it isn't ideal to arrive at places wet and cold, as it can make you vulnerable to getting sick. However, that hasn't stopped 12% of residents in the Finnish city of Oulu from cycling daily in the winter. If you want shelter while travelling to work, a private vehicle may be for you. Private vehicles can come in many forms, including cars and vans, but for simplicity and familiarity, I'll be referring to private vehicles as cars. Cars are a common way to get around in many parts of the world, but what pros and cons does it bring? One positive of cars is that you can use them at any time. No timetables, no stressing about missing the bus or train. You just simply jump in and start driving. This can be useful in the night time or in the early hours of the morning, where there aren't as many public transport services operating. Another positive of cars is that they're able to carry large or lots of items. One of the cons of walking and cycling is that it's not easy to move large items around. If you have a hobby that requires large or lots of equipment, it isn't practical to move them around by walking and cycling, as I mentioned earlier. With a car, you can store more or bigger items in the boot of your car or in the back seat, which makes moving these items much easier. One final positive of cars is that they're a useful way of moving around in rural locations. These areas tend to have low and or sparse populations, and so public transport is not as common in these areas. This is true here in New Zealand, where there's unfortunately not much regional rail that can be found in these areas, a topic I'll cover in another video. Now for the negative of cars, the first of which is a pretty obvious one, and that is the traffic that comes with them. Traffic is unfortunately a big problem in many cities around the world, including here in Auckland, which I've made a whole video about. Cars are an inefficient way of transporting a large amount of people in a short amount of time, which you can see with events as well, with a single car lane having a capacity of 1,500 to 2,000 people per hour, according to Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, much less than walking and cycling, and other modes that I'll cover later. Our second negative of cars is that they are an environmentally friendly mode of transport. Cars are notorious for their environmental impacts, with cars producing significantly more emissions than walking, cycling, and other modes I'll cover later. Road vehicles account for 90% of New Zealand's transport greenhouse gas emissions, with transport as a whole accounting for 18% of overall emissions, making cars and road vehicles very carbon intensive. The final negative of cars is their cost. Cars are expensive to own and run, with cars costing about $5,000 to $10,000 per year, according to Money Hub, which is a significant amount of money, particularly for those on lower incomes. Additionally, roads are expensive to build and maintain, with new road projects in New Zealand and elsewhere in the world often costing over $1 billion to build. If you want to take your mind off the bumper-to-bumper traffic, perhaps the bus is for you. Buses are the first public transport mode on this list, and they're the most common one as well, especially here in Auckland, where I'm currently doing a series where I ride every bus route in Auckland. But what about its pros and cons? The first positive of buses is that they're much cheaper to travel on than cars. As I mentioned with the negatives of cars, the cost of cars can take a sizable amount of people's budgets. With buses, you just need a credit card or bus pass to hop on, with buses even being free in the European country of Luxembourg and other places. Another positive of buses is that they are able to cover multiple routes and can be a way of connecting to other transport modes. Since buses are able to use roads, they can connect residential areas to transport hubs. Although routes like these tend to be less frequent due to the areas they're serving being primarily filled with low density housing. A third positive of buses is that they're able to make use of existing streets and don't require dedicated infrastructure to set up. This makes buses an easy mode to implement, with other bus dedicated infrastructure also coming in cheaper, like bus lanes for example, which often only requires reallocating one car lane to a bus lane, without widening the road. Now for the negatives of buses. The first of which is they get stuck in traffic when there's little to no bus priority given on congested roads. As I touched on in the positive buses, they are easy mode to implement. However, if there's a lack of bus lanes on busy roads, then buses are also stuck in the slow moving traffic. This can make travel times unreliable and slower compared to other transport modes that I'll cover later. Our second negative of buses is that they don't have much capacity. Looking at the chart from earlier, buses have a capacity of 5,000 per hour when mixed with general traffic, and 9,000 for single lane of bus rapid transit, like a bus lane. While those have higher capacities than cars, they are still lower than other transport modes. However, if there's 2 lanes of bus rapid transit, like a busway for example, capacity can increase to up to 40,000 people per hour. But this does come with the drawback of bus congestion in city centres, with this bus sausage in Auckland being one example. A reason why light rail was suggested as an alternative, a mode that will be covered later in the video. A third negative of buses is that they're not the most comfortable mode of transport. Buses can be a bumpy ride due to the length of the vehicle, and the small jerks that can be felt with the constant starting and stopping. And this isn't helped by some bus seats being uncomfortable, with buses in cities often having very basic comfort and small legroom due to the high turnover of passengers. If you find your bus ride is caught up in traffic, you can zoom past it by using the train. Trains have been a popular mode of transport for over 200 years, especially in the 19th century, where it was very popular in countries like USA, UK, and even here in New Zealand. But what about its pros and cons? One positive of trains is that they have their own dedicated space. As I touched on with buses can get stuck in traffic with lack of priority. With trains, however, there are far fewer trains that run on tracks than cars or on roads, and so congestion on train lines are less common, leading to more reliable travel times, which bodes well for the next positive of trains, their capacity. Trains have a much higher capacity than other transport modes, with the chart from earlier showing trains having a capacity between 40,000 and 60,000 passengers per hour, significantly higher than cars, buses, walking, and cycling, the 4 modes I talked about already. The high capacity of rail allows more people to move around at peak commute times, and relieve pressure on modes and other transport options. The capacity is even higher for suburban rail, also known as commuter rail, which, as its name suggests, is used to transport people to the city centre from outer suburbs or nearby towns, without the need to stress about traffic and finding the park, which leads to my final positive, trains. Our third positive of trains is that you can do other activities while you're travelling. As mentioned, most people live very busy lives, and trying to get many tasks done can be stressful and time consuming. On a train, since someone else is driving it, you have the option of doing other activities. Activities can be work related like replying to emails or working on the next project. Or it could be something simple like relaxing or looking out the window. When you're driving or cycling, you must be fully focused on moving your vehicle or bike while looking at your surroundings, something that is not required when travelling on a train, with a train driver taking you to a destination. Now for the negatives. The first of which is that trains require tracks to operate. While this is the positive due to trains avoiding conflict with other modes, it is also a negative as train tracks are required to be built and maintained for trains to run. Additionally, train tracks and stations are expensive to build, as they can cost billions, particularly in build-up areas if there's no dedicated land reserved for future expansion. Another negative of trains is that while they do a good job of moving people from place to place, you may require another mode of transport to get to your destination. While there are transit-oriented developments around, in some places, particularly rural, getting to your final location could be difficult, and as I mentioned, you may require another form of transport, like car or a bike, to get to your final destination. One final negative of trains is that it's challenging to build train lines over steep terrains like mountains. Mountains may give you great scenery, but this comes at the expense of speed, due to trains requiring more force to overcome the slopes and climb, with the Glacier Express in Switzerland taking over 8 hours to travel nearly 300, an average pace of 30 km per hour. As such, it's more economical to build tunnels through mountains, which is expensive. Despite its challenging geography, Switzerland, which I just talked about, has an extensive rail network covering the whole country, with even wealthy individuals using it due to its convenience. From above ground to below, underground metros are next. Underground metros have been around since the 19th century, with 2 notable examples including the London Tube network and New York subways, both among the most used public transport networks in the world. Metros can be found above ground as well, but for this example, I'll be focusing on underground metros. So what are the positives and negatives of underground metros? The first positive of metros is their reliable travel times. Like train lines, metros do not face much conflict from other modes, and so it's less likely to be caught up in delays, unlike cars. In London, travelling from place to place can be faster than other modes due to its comprehensive tube network, with it taking 13 minutes to get from King's Cross Station, one of London's busiest tube stations at the edge of central London, to Emirates Stadium in North London, the home of Arsenal Football Club, with the time being slightly faster than driving. Following on from that, another positive of underground metros is that they are also very efficient at moving lots of people in a short amount of time. Since metros are fast and frequent, they are able to move large numbers, with a typical metro system having a capacity of 36,000 people per hour. Additionally, underground metros aren't reliant on weather events to operate, unlike above ground metros, which can be vulnerable to extreme temperature swings and weather events. One final positive of metros is that they produce less noise than heavy rail, or trains. As train lines and stations are often found above ground, it can be noisy living next to one, as trains produce an average of 60 to 80 decibels. In contrast, the noise of metros are suppressed due to the land above it acting as a sound barrier, and so if done right, underground metros wouldn't be as disruptive to residents who live above or near stations. Now onto the negatives of metros. The first of which is that metros are expensive to build. While metros are a quick and efficient way of getting around cities, their costs are significant due to the complication of building tunnels and stations underneath existing urban areas. The Sydney Metro network, that opened in 2020 with an extension following in 2024, was estimated to cost $20 billion, $9 billion more than anticipated, which while was very beneficial in improving transport accessibility in Sydney, did come with a large price tag, and the next negative of metros. With that negative being metros being very time consuming to construct. As mentioned, building underground stations and train lines requires very complex engineering, which causes the construction of metros to be much longer than projects built above ground. With the aforementioned Sydney Metro extension, while amazing in itself, taking 7 years to build, which was very disruptive for businesses and residents close to the construction site. One final negative for underground metros is the fire and flood risks. Fires and floods are able to go more easily underground due to less access to stations and being harder to detect in the case of fires, which can severely damage underground infrastructure and be a terrifying situation for those who find themselves caught up in it. Now that we've gone over the most basic and generic forms of transport, we'll move on to common modes. Common modes are transport modes that might not be found in every city in the world, but they're found in a good amount. For common modes, I'll be listing 2 positives and 2 negatives for each. We'll start our common modes with our first water-based transport mode, ferries. Ferries are a common way to move people or goods around on water, and it's common in cities like here in Auckland, which is a water-based city. But what about the pros and cons of ferries? One positive of ferries is that they're a useful way of moving between islands or coasts without building a bridge or tunnel. As I touched on already, bridges and tunnels are expensive to build due to the design and engineering that takes place. By using ferries as an alternative, there wasn't a need to construct an expensive and lengthy tunnel or bridge that would take years to build, and instead just simply transport people and goods on a singular ferry, like here in Auckland, where there's ferries connecting multiple islands off Auckland's coast, like Waiheke Island. Another positive of ferries is that they don't get stuck in traffic. Since ferries travel in water, they generally don't get caught up in congestion, as there's much less water vehicles moving around, similar to the train. There's also the option to do other activities, like work, looking at the views on the water, or just simply relaxing. Funnily enough, I actually worked on the script of this video while travelling on the ferry and seeing the views of Auckland's harbour. Now for the negatives of ferries. The first of which is that ferries are expensive to operate compared to other transport modes. In 2023, it cost Auckland $50 million to operate 27 ferries each year, an average of $1.8 million per ferry, with buses on the other hand costing between $200,000 to $300,000 to run in 2012. Although this figure would be higher now, but still significantly lower running costs compared to ferries. Another negative of ferries is its speed. While ferries don't get stuck in congestion, the trade-off is their speed, with ferries moving at an average pace of 46 km per hour. There's also speed restrictions in some places, with Auckland's Waitemata Harbour having a speed restriction of 12 knots or 22 km, and closure from weather disruption. From the water to the land, trams, or more commonly known as light rail, is next. Light rail, as its name suggests, is a lighter form of rail transit, with this often running on long roads. In fact, many cities around the world, including here in Auckland, had comprehensive tram networks in the early 1900s. However, these were mostly removed in the 1950s due to prioritisation of cars. But what are the positives and negatives of trams? One positive of light rail is their capacity is higher than that of other transport modes, like buses. As I talked about earlier, one of the reasons that light rail was suggested in Auckland was due to some of the bus routes near capacity, and the bus congestion in the city centre. Using the chart from earlier, light rail's capacity is between 18 to 20,000 people, which is higher than buses, and it also reduces the pressure on roads. Our second positive of light rail is its comfort. As I talked about with buses, they can be uncomfortable due to the constant starting and stopping of most bus trips. With light rail, however, they are a more comfortable ride as they generally run in straight lines and have fewer stops than buses, which also makes it more reliable. Now for the negatives of light rail. The first of which is that routes are inflexible. Similar to trains, light rail requires its own dedicated space to operate, which makes routes limited to the space dedicated to light rail. Buses, meanwhile, can serve main roads and quiet residential areas. Another negative of light rail is that it's expensive to build. In Sydney, its L2 and L3 light rail lines cost around $3 billion, which while it's not the most expensive mode to build, is still quite a sum of money. Additionally, light rail construction is also disruptive, with the aforementioned lines taking over 5 years to build, but as of 2024, both lines average over 40,000 passengers per day, with the benefits of increased capacity and reduced greenhouse gas emissions ultimately worth the cost and disruption. We're sticking with rail for the next mode, but instead of on the ground like light rail, we're going a bit up in the sky with the monorail. The monorail is an elevated train that travels on a single track, and these systems tend to be found in Asian countries. But what are the positives and negatives of the monorail? One positive of the monorail is that they require less space than other transport modes. Unlike surface rail, monorail's elevated position does not physically separate lanes either side of it, which also allows movement under monorails, while surface rail requires a bridge or an underpass to be built between 2 points that are separated by it, both for safety reasons and so people travelling by other modes aren't held up when the train is active. Another positive of monorails is that they don't get stuck in traffic. As I've talked about a lot in this video, modes that don't rely on roads are able to bypass traffic. This is especially true for monorails, which are mostly grade separated, and so as a result, have more reliable travel times, like trains. Now for the negatives of monorails, one of which is that they have limited branching opportunities. One advantage of both light and heavy rail that I didn't talk about is that they're able to branch off into different lines. With monorails, however, it's a different story. Since monorails wrap onto the sides of the track, it is much more difficult for them to transfer to other lines, unlike light and heavy rail, and so it makes the citywide network more difficult. Another negative of monorails is that monorail loops can be ineffective. Since monorails travel in a single direction, you must take the full loop if the station you want to get off was the station before, which makes it longer and therefore quicker to take other modes. This reason was one of the factors behind the failure of Sydney's monorail system, which operated more like a tourist attraction than an actual transportation mode. City Moose, another urban planning YouTuber and one of the many inspirations for this channel, has a full video on the failure of the Sydney monorail if you're interested. Link is in the description. For our next mode, we're staying with elevated transport modes, this one being the gondola. The gondola is an overhead transport system that uses aerial lifts to move around in a constant loop, and they're often found in hilly cities like La Paz in Bolivia, the highest capital city in the world. But what are the positives and negatives of gondolas? The first positive of gondolas is that they're a useful way of transporting people in places with hilly environments. As I talked about with the negatives of trains, building transport connections over challenging terrains is both complex and expensive. With gondolas, however, they are able to take straightforward routes up mountains, which also provides you with a stunning view of the area below. Another positive of gondolas is their high frequencies. Since gondolas are constantly moving, they are a very frequent mode, with an average frequency of 1 minute. They also don't get caught up in road delays. But there is one thing that should be considered when deciding to build gondolas, and I'll cover that now. Now for the negatives of gondolas, one of which is that they're really reliant on the system functioning. While this is true for most transport systems, with cable cars, one minor error to the system would bring it to a jolting halt, which wouldn't be good for any passengers who find themselves travelling via gondola, particularly those who are scared of heights. Another negative of gondolas is that they're a slow mode of transport. Despite their very high frequencies, they aren't a fast mode, with the Maokon gondola in Taiwan moving at an average pace of 12 km per hour, which is not very fast, but at least it's a smoother ride than the nearby road, which travels up a mountain. From the scenic views of the mountains to busy streets, next mode up is the taxi. Taxis are similar to cars, but they have a professional driver driving them, and they pick up and drop off passengers at various locations. But what are the positives and negatives of taxis? One positive of taxis is that they cover many routes. Similar to cars, taxis are very flexible modes, and as a result, you can get to your destination directly, unlike other modes, where you may have to transfer to another train or bus for the last leg of your journey. Another positive of taxis is that you don't have to operate them. Like other public transport modes, taxis are run by train drivers, and so you're able to take your mind off what's happening around. This relieves any stress you may have about driving. But what about the negatives of taxis? Now for the negatives of taxis. The first of which is that taxis are expensive. Although taxis are able to put you on the doorstep of the destination, their cost may encourage you to take the bus or train instead. In Auckland, each kilometre travelled by a taxi costs $3.50, with a 20-kilometre trip from Auckland to CBD costing about $76, which is much more expensive than taking public transport. Our second negative of taxis is that they aren't an efficient mode in the mass transit system. Since taxis are similar to cars, they take up a lot of space while transporting very few residents, which adds to traffic congestion if viable alternatives aren't provided. From 4 wheels to 2. Next mode up is the scooter. Like bikes, scooters are a human-powered mode of transport, and they can also come in the form of e-scooters. But what are the positives and negatives of scooters? The first positive of scooters is that it is an accessible transport mode. Like walking and cycling, scooters do not require any registration to start with, which makes it accessible to both young and old. I myself used to scooter around when I was young, and can admit my young self did prefer it over walking. Another positive of scooters is that they are a sustainable mode of transport. Because scooters are an active mode of transport, they do not require fossil fuels to operate, with the average carbon emissions per kilometre for the manufacture and maintenance of an electric scooter being only 27 grams, significantly less than cars. Now onto the negatives of scooters. The first of which is that scooters can be an unsafe mode of transport if there isn't safe and protected infrastructure. Like walking and cycling, scootering along a busy road between cars is dangerous, as you're having to watch your surroundings, and along footpaths as well, particularly ones with lots of pedestrians. Similarly, scooters aren't super effective over long distances. Following on from the first negative of safety, scooting over long distances in cities isn't easy due to the amount of crossings of streets and the fast moving roads. This doesn't mean travelling from one part of the city to another can be done by scooter, but it is something that mostly experienced and or confident riders would attempt. For a final common transport mode, we're sticking with 2 wheels with the motorbike. Motorbikes are a smaller motor vehicle that the motorist must do well to balance. But what are the positives and negatives of a motorbike? One positive of motorbikes is that they take up less space than cars. One of the negatives of cars is that they get stuck in traffic due to the inefficiency of moving lots of people in a short amount of time. With motorbikes, however, as you can see from this video, there is heavy traffic, but the size of the motorbike allows this person to pass multiple cars that are stuck in the gridlock, and therefore have a quicker journey than those who are in cars. Another positive of motorbikes is that they are cheaper than cars. As I talked about already, cars are very expensive to own and operate, with the average cost of one in a car in Auckland being around $5,000 to $10,000 a year. While motorbikes are still expensive, the average cost is around $4,000, which is over half the price of an average car. The first negative of motorbikes is that they produce a lot of noise pollution. While motorbikes may be cheaper, they are one of the loudest modes of transport, with motorbikes producing around 90 to 100 decibels, which can lead to hearing damage if exposed to the noise for a long period. Our second negative of motorbikes is that they are a dangerous mode of transport. While you're able to pass cars that are stuck in traffic, their small size does make it vulnerable to collisions with cars, with 40 people dying from motorbike crashes in Auckland between 2017 and 2021, and many more injured. Additionally, it is 21 times more likely for a motorcyclist to die in a road incident compared to a car passenger, which does make this particular transport mode a very dangerous one. For the last section of transport modes, we'll be looking at unusual or obscure ones. These modes tend to be used for recreational activities, although they still qualify as a transport mode, albeit very niche. For obscure transport modes, we'll be looking at 1 positive and 1 negative of each mode. And like common modes, we start with a water-based transport mode. Jet ski. Jet skis are a water vehicle that's primarily used for recreational activities. However, you can get around on them by transport as well. But what's 1 positive and 1 negative of jet ski? A positive of a jet ski is that it can be used to bypass traffic. As mentioned, water-based modes of transport do not get stuck in the slow cool winter weather. The negative of using the jet ski for transport is that they need to be licensed and can't be used by those under the age of 15, as well as requiring a secure place to park when not being used. We're staying with water-based modes for our next transport mode. Swimming. Swimming is one of the most popular events at the Olympics, but it can be used for transport as well, with some residents in the European country of Switzerland using the Rhine River, a popular river in Western Europe, to get around for travel. But what are the positives and negatives of swimming? A positive of swimming for transport is that, like walking and cycling, swimming is a human-powered form of transport, and so while swimming, you're getting daily exercise. Swimming also requires no registration or license. All you need is some good swimming skills, and you can swim your way into work. Which leads me to the negative of swimming for transport. You need to be a strong swimmer. Swimming requires a lot of stamina, which makes it only recommended over short distances. From the water to the air, paraglider is the next mode. This might seem an unusual mode. Aren't paragliders a recreational activity? Well, I managed to find someone in the UK countryside who actually travels around using paragliders. But what are the positives and negatives of paragliders? A positive of using the paraglider is that you can get quite excited for the day. Since you're experiencing the adrenaline of being high in the sky, it energizes you to be ready for a busy day of work. With the person in the UK explaining, you arrive integrated, excited, full of energy, full of drive, full of ideas. It only makes the day better. Paraglider does seem like a thrilling way to get around. But what's a negative of using it for transport? A negative of using paraglider for transport is that it's only practical in rural areas. This is due to airspace restrictions in urban areas, which makes it unsafe to fly over cities. Additionally, paragliders require a lot of training, which makes this mode not for the faint-hearted, although it is one that's thrilling. We'll stay with the air for the next mode of transport, planes. Planes are generally used to move between cities on an international or domestic scale, but as I'll get to in a second, there is someone who travels daily on planes for education. But what's one positive and one negative of travelling by plane? A positive of using the plane as a daily transport mode is that it can be cheaper than renting in major cities. This might seem strange. Isn't air travel expensive as well? Well, actually, a university student in Vancouver actually commuted from the nearby city of Calgary to Vancouver each week due to the cost of renting in Vancouver, being in the air multiple times a week. This does lead to the pretty obvious negative, however. The negative of using planes as a day-to-day transport mode is pretty obvious. It takes a lot of time, and you also have to make your way through airport queues on a regular basis, which can be messy. You're also relying on air conditions, which if poor can lead to flights getting cancelled or delayed, and I don't think many would want to take that risk of how important time is. For a final air-based mode, we have the helicopter. The helicopter is an aircraft that uses rotating blades to move around, and they're commonly used to transport injured patients to hospitals. But what's a positive and negative of helicopters? One positive of using helicopters is that they don't get stuck in traffic. As I've talked about many times in this video, air-based modes are able to bypass traffic, which makes travel times very quick and reliable, and also gives you a great view while traveling. While the view from the helicopter may be great, the negative of that is that helicopters are very expensive to buy, with a basic helicopter costing an average of at least $200,000. Helicopters also require a place to land, which is also expensive, which makes helicopters a very luxury transport mode for private travel. For a final transport mode, we have horses. Horses were a very common way of getting around in the 17th and 18th centuries, but this was before cars, planes, and trains were common. Despite this, horses are still used in rural areas. So what's one positive and one negative of using horses to get around? One positive of using horses as a transport mode is that it's a very useful way of moving around areas where access to cars or buses are very limited. Despite significant urbanization taking place over the last century, just under half the world's population lives in rural areas, about 4 billion people. Horses are also able to travel over grass, something that other transport modes struggle or can't do. A negative of using horses for travel is that there's not much space for them to be used in urban areas, with all the land that's been developed. The world has changed significantly, and with the way cities have developed, horses are just not practical to move around urban areas today. We've now covered many different transport modes, from generic ones like buses to obscure ones like swimming. All of these modes match the criteria I set out at the start, moving you at least 1 kilometer, being functional, and being used by someone in the world. However, there are other modes that could be considered transport modes, but didn't match my criteria. We're going to have a quick look at some of those modes that didn't quite qualify. Hang glider is a human-powered mode of transport where you push yourself in the air and guide yourself. If you're younger, you may remember playing a Flash game where a penguin attempts to fly using a hang glider, which is what you're seeing on screen right now. However, hang gliders don't qualify as a transport mode, because unlike a paraglider, it relies on human power to travel, and so it's only effective over very short distances, thus failing the distance criteria. Like hang glider, Jetpack is another air-based mode, which also just happened to be a minigame of a popular kids website in the early 2010s. Similar to hang gliders, air regulations prevent jetpacks from being a functional mode of transport in cities, but I also couldn't find any evidence of someone using jetpacks to get around on a daily basis. We're staying with air modes with blimps. Blimps are found in the sky and were common back in the 1920s and 30s, but after that period, blimps would decline in popularity, and I couldn't find any evidence of someone using blimps to get around on a daily basis, so it doesn't qualify. Now for the final air mode that didn't qualify, hot air balloons. Hot air balloons have been around since the late 1700s, being older than the plane, which while providing scenic views, require a lot of steering and also require a place to land, which limits the functionality of hot air balloons to scenic tours. Switching from the sky to the snow, skiing is a fun winter activity where you travel down snowy mountains at an accelerating pace. As a transport mode, however, I couldn't find evidence of anyone using it. However, there may be someone in rural Finland who might be skiing around for daily travel, who knows. So there you have it. We've covered 19 different transport modes in this video, from generic modes like buses and bikes, to obscure modes like plane and paraglider. There are many fascinating modes along these 19 transport modes, and all have their positives and negatives, but which one do I think is the best? In my opinion, transport modes that are environmentally friendly, efficient, and high capacities are the best modes, with the best mode I've taken, at least in my opinion, being the train, due to its reliable travel times, its efficiency, and the fact that I can do multiple activities on a train. Now let's get a reliable regional rail network in New Zealand, so that I can explore the whole country on trains and look at the exclusive scenery that is absolutely amazing. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, consider liking and subscribing to see more videos like this one. What transport modes do you take? Did you discover a new transport mode today? Did I forget a particular transport mode? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, I'm Sam, aka Kiwi Planner, and I'll see you in the next video.